Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name's Rachel and this is Stitched Up, and welcome back to another Top Tip Tuesday. This week we are going to be tackling this, a V-neck neckline, and I know that these can cause the chills in lots of people, especially if you've never attempted one before. We are going to be sewing a perfect V-neck neckline in a woven fabric, in a fabric on the fold. So your front bodice piece will be on the fold, because this is the most difficult V-neck technique to achieve, to get that really nice flawless V-neck finish at the front without any puckering. So what I'm going to talk about today is the first thing you need to remember with a V-neck like this. You can see how this is hugging my body, and the key thing with a V-neck line is that this neckline edge will always be on the bias, so you need to stabilize this edge as soon as you've cut this out, and that's really important. So when you are working with anything, any edge that's cut on the bias, you need to be really careful that you don't handle the fabric too much before you've stabilized any bias edges. And the reason for that is because we all know on the bias fabric stretches, and that will give you a gapy neckline if you don't stabilize the edge before you start working with it. So one of the key things I would say is, as soon as you've cut your V-neck out, if you have a bias edge there, you need to stabilize it before you start moving your fabric around, playing with it, etc, so that it doesn't stretch out of shape and you end up with a gapy neckline that's all wibbly and not looking very nice, and potentially showing off a little bit more than you'd like to show. So there's various ways of stabilizing a neckline. You can use stay stitching, which, to be honest, works on some fabrics, not so successful on others. I'm thinking cottons and the heavier weight fabrics, it tends to work quite well, but on lighter weight fabrics, which are particularly a lot of your blouse fabrics like viscoses, your tencels, your georgettes, chiffons, silks, anything like that, I always find stay stitching really difficult. And that's personally for me, just because I find no matter what stitch length I use, that it tends to pucker up the fabric. So I don't tend to use stay stitching myself, but by all means, it's a good technique to stabilize that edge before you start working with it. I tend to use a stabilizing tape, which I will be showing you in this video, so look out for that. I will leave links to where you can buy this down below. You can't, well, I've not seen anywhere that's got it in the quantity I've got, because I bought mine as a bit of a remnant sale ages ago from Miss Chloe, who is a Facebook seller, and I've never seen her sell it since, to be honest, but you can buy it in much smaller quantities, so I tend to use that. It has a ribbon within it that's like a twill with ribbon with interfacing, so it's iron-on interfacing around it, so it's got that ribbon is taut, and then obviously you iron it on and it just stabilizes, and that's within the seam allowance, and it gives you a nice sort of firm edge to your garment. But if you don't have that, or you don't want to buy it, as I say, stay stitching works well. You can use remnants of your own of the fabric that you're using. So for instance, the selvage edge, you can cut tiny strips of that and use that to stabilize, but you'd have to sew over it. You can use bits of interfacing. Anything that's just going to stabilize that edge is going to help you to achieve a really nice neat finish. And I've just realized that all the way through this I'm touching my chest, aren't I? So anyway, I'm sure you get the idea. So that's the first tip that I will say, but the rest of how we put this together, we're going to head on over to the video footage now for you. And yeah, I hope you enjoy. If you have any comments, as always, then do feel free to leave them down in the comments box below. And I will see you next time. Take care. Bye. Here we go. We're starting with a calico version of my bodice block and the facing. So I am using the Atelier Skamit Declique pattern, which is the pattern I've used for the top that I'm wearing at the start of this video. And I have basically cut off the front bodice piece, which is here on the fold, and also the facing, and you can see the curved V-neck facing of this. Your V-neck might not be curved, mine is, so I'm going to show you how we are going to sew this V-neck front so that it ends up looking nice and neat with no puckering. What I've got here is just another small scrap to show you what can happen when you don't stabilise the neckline. So this edge here is the bias edge, and you can see how stretchy that is. And over time, if you're working with a fabric such as a viscose or something that's really drapey, I mean, remember this is calico, it's going to stretch out, and that's what causes the gaping and your pattern not matching up and puckering, etc. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that you do stabilise this neckline. I mentioned stabilising tape at the beginning of this video. This is the stuff that I use, and it's got that sort of cord in the center with iron-on interfacing around it, and essentially all I'm going to do is iron this on to the wrong side of my front bodice piece, just within the seam allowance of that bias neckline edge. If you don't have this, as I mentioned earlier, there are other options. I will leave a link to where you can buy this down below in smaller quantities. So I've ironed that on now, which has stabilised this front neckline. You don't need to do it with your facing piece, but you do need to do it to your actual outer bodice piece. So what we're going to do now is we are going to pin the facing in place, and I'm going to start at the center front. So it's always useful to know exactly where the center front on your facing is and on your bodice. So you can sort of press a little bit of a crease in there, but be careful because you don't want to end up with not being able to press that crease out on your finished garment. But start at the center front and then work outwards up either side of your front bodice V neckline and pin your facing right sides together to your bodice front. And then what we're going to do next before we take this to the sewing machine is we are going to draw a straight line down that center front with a marking pen. So again, you've got lots of options with this. You can use chalk, you can use friction pens. Just make sure that your friction pen does come out of the fabric that you're using. I am going to use a washable marker because that's my marker of choice at the moment. But essentially what I'm going to do next is I am just going to draw a straight line down from that point of the V-neck in the center. So I've got my ruler here and I've got my marker, my washable marker, and I'm just drawing a straight line down there. I know you can't see this very well, but I do go over this a little bit later in the video. So just zooming in here, you should be able to see directly down that center front there. I'll just take the pin out to show you. I have a mark almost at the center front. I know it's just slightly off there, but you know, I've got old eyes, what can I say? So moving across to the sewing machine, what we're going to do now is we are going to stitch the facing to the front bodice piece, and we are going to start when I eventually get round to it. There we go. So we are going to start at one of the shoulder seams and work our way down to the center front. And you just want to use your normal stitch length for this, and obviously make sure you are sewing at the seam allowance for your particular project. I'm using a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance here, and you need to make sure that your needle is in the down position so that you can pivot at that center front. This is really, really important for you to get that nice crisp deep V point at this point. So I am sewing down to the center front, and what I'm going to do next is just mark in that line again in a brighter colour so that you can see it. And it's really important to have this line here so you know exactly where your sewing needs to stop at that deep V point. And as I mentioned, the needle needs to be in the down position, so sew right until your needle is on your marking that you've made, and then you can raise the presser foot with the needle still in the down position. Turn your projects around and carry on sewing up the other side of your bodice right up to the opposite shoulder seam. So I'm doing that with my 1.5 centimeter seam allowance all the way up the other side of the bodice, continuing sewing the facing to the bodice right sides together until we get to the end. And then when you take your work out of your sewing machine, you should end up with something that looks like this. And I'm trying really hard here to get this to focus because my camera's quite close to the work, but yeah, you should be able to see that that V-neck point is right on that center front. So back over at my cutting table, what we need to do now is we need to cut into this V-front neckline, and you need to be really careful here. Make sure you've got some really sharp scissors. You need to be cutting right up to your stitching line, but making sure that you don't cut through that stitching, because that would be bad. So yeah, make sure you've got some really sharp pointed scissors. And then, because my neckline is slightly curved, I am going to cut in to the raw edges up to my stitching line, just round that curve, just so that when I understitch the facing, I can get really close, and it's going to ensure that this lies really flat. So you can see me cutting through. It's a little bit awkward to do this when you have used stabilizing tape, because obviously you've got to cut through that sort of stable thread underneath, which can be a little bit awkward. And then you can see what I'm doing now is I'm just getting rid of some of this bulk as we go towards that point, and I'm just doing this, just tapering away the seam allowance right to that V-neck point and that first cut that we made to the point. So you should end up with something that looks like that, and this is going to help just to get rid of some of that excess bulk in that area there, and means when we understitch this, and there we go, turn it round the right way, that it's going to sit really neatly on the inside. So what we're going to do now is what I'm showing you. We're going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to understitch the facing to the seam allowance. And you want to work independently here, so you are working both sides independently. We're not going to pivot at the bottom and go back up the other side this time. We are basically going to understitch. So I'm working from the top of the facing here, so that's the right side of the facing. The bodice, the right side of the bodice is on my left, and that's my right side of the facing on the right, and I am stitching the facing to the seam allowance underneath, and I am just going to manipulate the rest of this fabric so that I get right to the V point. And I'm going to tie off, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the other side, but independent from the side that we've just done. So I'm working from the V point again, and just zooming in here, hopefully you can see, moving everything else out of the way. What I'm attempting to do is start my stitching right at that V point of the other side. Again, the bodice is on the left, the facing on the right, and I am stitching the facing to the seam allowance from the right side, working all the way back up towards the opposite shoulder. And when you've got the needle in the down position, you should be able to move everything out of the way so that you can make sure you're not getting anything puckered or stuck within that V point when you're manipulating your fabric round. So when you've done that, you should have something that looks a bit like this. So you've got your understitching there. Now what we're going to do is we're going to fold everything to the inside, and we need to give this a really good press. So we'll work from the wrong side of the bodice here, and we'll take it over to the iron and give it a good press. So here I am at my flamingo covered ironing board, because what else would I have on my ironing board? And I'm working from the wrong side, and I am using a really hot iron on this because it's calico and it's got lots of creases in it. But obviously make sure you use the right setting for your particular fabric. And yes, I know I'm ironing this and I'm not pressing it. I know, you know, we can all debate the differences between pressing and ironing, but I am giving it a good iron or press or whatever from both sides, and then we're making sure, you know, we're getting as many creases out as we possibly can. And then here we go. It should now look something like this. You should have a really lovely V-neck. We'll just need to finish off the raw edge of the facing here. You can do whatever you want with this. I am just going to overlock it, but you can use bias binding, you can use a pair of pinking shears, however you want to finish it. I've just used overlocking here. It's just white, but that was what was in my overlocker. And then we are more or less done. I'm going to snip off these tails of my overlocking. I don't thread them in. I've never found overlocking to come undone. I know that you can thread them through your other overlocking, but I don't do that. And then we should have our lovely V-front that should look something like this. I know there are still some creases, but that's the fabric. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.